All right, I don't think anybody knows more about arms control and nuclear threats than Rose Gottemoeller. She was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and before that, she was the chief arms negotiator for the US on the nuclear arms agreement known as START with Russia. And Rose is now a senior lecturer at Stanford University in the US and joins me from there. What do I have to do to get into your classroom?
Well, you have to sign up and pay Stanford tuition, which
I'll
is
do it. To be able to listen to
I would welcome it.
you as
I would
somebody who was
welcome
in the room, what a privilege.
you. Thank you, Dana. I actually worked on the treaty that we call the New START Treaty. The START Treaty entered into force in 1994. I also worked on that one as a very young staffer at the Department of State. But New START is the one that we completed in 2010. It entered into force in 2011.
President Biden has given a green light for Ukraine to use long range American manufactured and supplied ATACMS on Russian territory. Does that bring us to the brink of some kind of possible nuclear exchange with Russia, or is that just alarmist?
Well, I think it takes a lot of caution thinking through how these systems will be used, the ATACMS. From reading the press, I cannot tell what kinds of limitations the White House may have placed on the Ukrainians with regard to targets. For example, if I were in the White House and were advising the president, I would advise very strongly that the Ukrainians be not permitted to launch any attacks against nuclear targets, like bases where nuclear weapons are stored, or nuclear deployment sites like silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles. I would specifically exclude nuclear-related targets from the list. But for targets that are relevant to what the Ukrainians are suffering right now, which is severe attacks against their energy infrastructure, yeah, sure. But it all depends on what instructions or guidance was given to the Ukrainians.
And I think they're being careful not to release all of that. And it may be that they're just using ATACMS in the Kursk area, just over the border. I mean, it's only 180 mile, 190 mile range on the ATACMS. The idea that these missiles are going to be flying into Moscow or something is just silly, right? So it's really against, supposedly against arms depots, command and control centers, any of the launch sites that they may be hitting Ukraine from, if they can reach them with those ATACMS.
Yes, and I also have read in the press that it appears that the North Koreans who have come to aid the Russians are now preparing to launch attacks in order to regain the Kursk region territory that the Ukrainians have seized from the Russians. They did that last August and have been holding it ever since. And apparently, the North Koreans are going to be thrown into the battle to try to get that territory back. So perhaps the ATACMS will have a special role in defending that territory.
I think you just answered my question, why now?
Well, a number of reasons, no doubt. One is that the president is in his final months in office, and I think it's incumbent on him now to decide what additional major decisions he wants to get made in that time and carried forward. And so that, I think, is doubtless one reason. But there has been a long consideration of the situation that Ukraine is suffering this winter. And once again, the Russians are launching massed attacks against energy infrastructure, an attack against the city of Sumy only last night killed a number of people, including two children, and left a lot of people seriously injured. So, in addition to the attacks on energy infrastructure, the Russians keep going after civilian targets. In this case, they hit a couple of schools as well as other civilian facilities in Sumy. So it's really quite well. It's awful what they're doing.
Something like 900 missile and drone attacks last week, 200 of them alone on Saturday. I don't think, unless you're there on the ground, you really can't kind of digest the scale at which Russia is coming after Ukraine right now. And do you think that they're, winding up the throttle right now because they anticipate that they want to be in the best position as a new Trump administration talks about possible ceasefire talks?
Yes, I do think that that's coming into the calculations as well in all capitals, Kiev, Moscow, and Washington, as well as the European capitals, as they think through what the dynamics are going to be as President Trump arrives in office on January 20. I want to stress President Biden is the president until January 20. And so, for that reason, there's a very interesting transitional dynamic going on now that I think everyone's trying to get into the best possible position for upcoming negotiations. As President Trump, incoming President Trump, has promised that he will end this war famously within 24 hours. I'm not sure he can do that, but he seems to be wanting to get into a negotiation very, very quickly.
Putin and the Kremlin, they watch the news just like the rest of us. They think that maybe President Trump will be more sympathetic to the Kremlin on the issue of Ukraine. Do you think that may be a miscalculation if Trump pushes a ceasefire and doesn't get what he wants? In fact, this could go the other way. It could escalate more.
Absolutely. Mr. Trump really prides himself on being a master deal maker. And if he doesn't see the deal he wants shaping up, he's easily able to walk away from the table, as he did with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, during his first term in office. And so I think that all along we've heard from Putin this very kind of zero-sum approach. I'm going to deal out a crushing defeat to Ukraine, to NATO, and to the United States of America. Very zero-sum approach, winner take all. And I think that what he's going to have to consider with Donald Trump is that that's not the kind of deal that Trump will go for. So Putin's going to have to decide where he can give a little as well. And we'll see how that works out. But I really do think that this is not going to be a winner take all kind of negotiation, but going to have some win-win solutions for all participants.
Do you worry about the state of NATO? I mean, you were there. You know what the alliance has been able to accomplish in terms of security for Europe in post World War II. Do you think that the Trump administration and Trump specifically, rather than just trying to make a deal, understands what NATO has brought to the stability of Europe? And do you worry about whether he's prepared to abandon that?
The NATO that Mr. Trump will find now is much different from the one that he visited a number of times and, in a very tough manner, demanded that the NATO allies pay more. This was during his first administration when I was the Deputy Secretary General, and I observed the president come to NATO several times. He was really rough on the allies and said, pay up, or I'm not going to fulfill the Article 5 commitments. That's in the NATO founding treaty, the Washington Treaty. It's Article 5 is if one NATO ally is attacked, then other NATO allies must come to its assistance if asked for help. So he said, I'm not going to help you. If you don't pay up, forget about it. Or at times he threatened even withdrawing from NATO. But he's going to find a much different NATO now. The allies have gotten it clear in their minds that they need to pay more for their own defense, at least 2% of their gross domestic product, which is a different attitude than they had 5 years ago. And that was born of Putin's aggression in Ukraine. I think Mr. Trump started the momentum toward more defense spending, but it was Putin's invasion of Ukraine that was the real wake-up call. And certainly NATO has, I think, performed very well in terms of assisting Ukraine.
Rose, could NATO survive without the United States in it?
I believe it could. For one thing, I don't believe that Trump would completely withdraw from NATO. It's possible that he'll attempt something like I've called a soft withdrawal, that is, refusing to appoint a U.S. ambassador to NATO, or perhaps even refusing to appoint the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR. Always the top military man at NATO, has been a four-star general officer, admiral from the United States of America. So he may just refuse, to put the leadership in place, but I don't think he'll withdraw the United States completely from NATO. He's got an interest in continuing to have a presence in Europe and to be seen as a leader in Europe. So he may try to neglect NATO a bit, but I don't think he's going to try to withdraw completely.
If we just return to where we started, which is nuclear weapons and the START treaty specifically, and there were a series of them. There was START and START 2, and I get lost in the official names of them all. You can correct me on this, but are are the nuclear treaties, which for years have governed the number of weapons and where they're deployed and the information sharing between the two biggest nuclear powers, are those agreements dead right now, or are they somehow surviving despite this war in Ukraine?
Yes, they're hanging on by life support. The New START treaty is the treaty currently in force. It limits the United States and the Russian Federation to deploying 1,550 nuclear warheads each on 700 delivery vehicles. Those are missiles and bombers and so forth. So there are limits in place. However, the Russian President Vladimir Putin suspended implementation of the New START treaty in February of 2023, 1 year after the invasion of Ukraine. And he did so, saying as long as the United States and NATO are assisting Ukraine, no more nuclear arms control treaties, which to me that's shooting himself in the foot because he needs to keep the United States under control as much as we need to keep Russia under control. So it's a weird situation, but that's where it stands. Both countries
Because
are.
if I can just jump in, it's
Mhm.
because it's just not about the numbers, right? It is about confirming what the other side is saying. It's about information sharing. And the Russians, if you can explain it to me, got just as much as the Americans did out of those deals in terms of understanding where are the weapons, where are they deployed, where are they moving to? Do we know that they're not readying for something? There's a lot of there's a lot of in those agreements, the ability to make the other side feel safer.
Absolutely. These treaties are completely reciprocal. They're all about mutual predictability so that the Russians can't surprise us with a nuclear attack and vice versa. And heaven knows a nuclear attack could be the beginning of a very bad day, an existential threat to humanity. So in this case, we had on-site inspections. We exchanged data regularly about the deployment of our nuclear forces and the numbers that were deployed. And we also, on a daily basis, exchanged notifications about what was happening with those nuclear weapons. For example, if the Russians had an ICBM that needed maintenance, they would pull it out of the silo and send it to a maintenance facility, but they had to tell us that. And then we'd use our overhead satellites to check that what they notified was correct. So there's a whole lot of checks, verification, and monitoring measures that ensure we know what they're up to and vice versa. And that's what Putin suspended. We continue to be confident that they're not building up, again, because we can watch with our overhead satellites what they're doing. But on the other hand, we don't have that day in, day out fidelity into what they're up to with their nuclear weapon systems.
What about China, Rose? Do you feel now? I mean, they have 500. I think probably when you and I first started doing interviews, when you were still in Moscow, they had 300 weapons. Now it's 500. They're heading for 1,000.
Yeah, exactly. When we were talking in Moscow 15 years ago or more, the Chinese, we didn't even consider them a threat, aside from they had some weapons that they kept for retaliation in case they were attacked. They said they had no first use policy, and we didn't think they were going to ready a surprise first strike. So we were rather relaxed about their nuclear weapon systems. These days, we are not because they are clearly modernizing, building up their forces. They are headed to 1,000 by the year 2030. That is what the Department of Defense in the United States says. And by 2035, the Department of Defense believes that they could have 1,500 warheads. So that is a big buildup over the next 10 years. And it is very worrying to Washington and to people who focus on nuclear threats because it could mean we are facing two countries, Russia and China, each having similar numbers of nuclear weapons deployed and targeted against us.
And as you say that, the United States has a aging, I don't want to use the word failing, but you might say that nuclear arsenal that, I think you've said in other interviews that the Minuteman model, in some of the silos across America, you're not even sure whether they would exactly fire. I mean, I assume most of them would, but so there's this incredible now rejuvenation program of the US arsenal of $1.4 trillion dollars. Some people say it'll be 1.7 by the time it's done, and we know that these things tend to escalate beyond that. But um, is it needed? And do you have a concern about how it's going forward?
Yeah, Dana, let me just stress that I do think our currently deployed weapon systems are safe, secure, and effective. If they had to launch, they would launch. They are weapons of deterrence. We don't think about them as weapons we would use in fighting a nuclear war, in fighting a war, period. They are to deter the other side from attacking us. But I am very confident that they're effective. It's just that they're old. The Minuteman III has been in deployment, some of those missiles now for 30 years or more. And in the case of the Ohio class submarines, the first Ohio class boat was launched in the late 70s. So, these systems are old and they need to be modernized. They need to be replaced. And that's the program that you referred to. It's a modernization program. It's replacing our existing weapon systems with this, basically the same kind: intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched ballistic missiles, and bombers that are able to launch cruise missiles and also gravity bombs, drop gravity bombs. So it's a replacement one for one, and we're not building up. People say, oh, you're modernizing, you're increasing. At the moment, the policy of the United States is to replace those systems, but not to build up and increase. There is worry with what China's doing, but for the moment, I think we can be confident in our nuclear triad and in the modernization of our nuclear triad.
I know you're an advisor to the Council on Strategic Risks in the U.S. Andy Weber's there, the former Undersecretary of Defense, and others that I know, that they have come out and raised concerns about some of how the modernization is taking place. I know it's very detailed, but just if I asked you two examples of it that might concern you, would one be the fact that they are doing dial-a-yield weapons that somehow contemplate the use of a nuclear weapon um, on the battlefield, a smaller yield weapon, and also the fact that they're incorporating nuclear warheads into cruise missiles, which are also used in conventional war. And in a conflict, one side or the other may make a mistake and think that an incoming cruise missile has a nuclear warhead on it.
Right. Well, tell you honestly, Dana, these are problems that have been around since the 1980s. The United States warheads that exist already have a variable yield, so to say, and can be used at different yields. There is a new warhead that is being developed that's explicitly designed to, I guess, be easier to use from that perspective. But again, these are weapons of deterrence. They're not for fighting a war. They're designed to stay on the shelf and to be able to deter a possible aggressor at any level. That's why people say, well, we need some lower yield weapons because the Russians deploy lower yield weapons. So there's this notion that we have to have equivalence in terms of the capabilities available. I don't personally agree with that, but that's where we are. That's the decision that's been made. So there is a certain logic to it. Now, in terms of the dual use cruise missiles,
Mhm.
they have been in existence since the 1980s, and we have I think up to this point, done a lot to try to differentiate between, for example, air-launched cruise missiles that are associated with our strategic delivery vehicles, like our long-range bombers that could fly far enough to, if they had to, strike Russia from the United States. Those are ones that we associate with nuclear warheads, but ones that are being used in for example, in the war in Syria, those are clearly conventionally armed and have been only associated with delivery systems that are for conventional fighting.
Final thoughts, Rose, while I still have you. I mean, it's a very wobbly, dangerous time worldwide. What's number one on your list that worries you?
Well, number one on my list is the unpredictability right now of our nuclear forces combined with this terrible war of aggression that's going on in Ukraine. And the dynamics there are very uncertain. Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, those around him, they keep rattling the nuclear saber. And I think we have to take these threats seriously. I haven't seen anything like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis way back in 1962. So I do think that this is a time to be worried about the possibility of nuclear use once again, and it's something that we have to avoid. We haven't seen nuclear use in wartime since Nagasaki and Hiroshima back in 1945, 80 years this coming summer. So we need to keep it that way.
Yeah, and oddly enough, as you say that, it occurs to me we kind of shrug our shoulders and get used to another nuclear threat coming out of Russia and say, oh, well, they didn't deliver last time. They're probably not going to deliver this time. But I mean, you just can't imagine a worse scenario, more serious threats than that. So, Rose Gottemoeller of Stanford University now, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Dana. Great to be with you.